All right, I think that's it. Oh, wait.
Okay, so next I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker.
Hi.
Um, so we'll be hearing from Dr. Gay Bradshaw, whom holds a doctorate degree in ecology and psychology and has published and taught lectures in these fields all over. With her discovery of free roaming elephant PTSD, she authored the Pulitzer Prize nominated Elephants on the Edge, What Animals Teach Us About Humanity. Her research expertise includes the effects of violence on and trauma recovery for elephants, grizzly bears, chimpanzees, parrots, and other species. So I'm not going to bore you with much more information, and just it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bradshaw with our topic today, Sensing and Seeing the Wild, Neuropsychology and Trauma of Orcas, Elephants, and Other Animal Kin.
Hi, hello, and thank you very much for being here and inviting me. It's a real treat, and I appreciate you being here, even it's after half of probably a very hard week. But thank you for your patience. And I have to say that listening to Paul Nicklin is I kind of got involved in it myself. I was thinking that someone else was going to talk, but it's actually going to be me. Anyways, I wanted to thank you for inviting me here. And I'll just start. I hope all of you were able to see that. This was just a short clip, and I wanted you to hear it from literally the horse's mouth from Paul Nicklin. He's an underwater diver, does a lot of work with National Geographic, and specifically he spends a lot of time in the Antarctic. The reason this is such an extraordinary piece, as well as entertaining, was because of his own recounting, and in his experience this really stood out. There are really the kinds of things that he does talk about are things that we encounter ourselves in some ways, whether it's in our home with the animals with whom we live of different site, in different species, or when not infrequently when we're outside in the wild. This is a gentleman from Australia who's assiduously trying to take a photograph, and these cockatoos are giving him, or I think they're trying to help and see what he's doing, but they're trying to help him with that. So we have these encounters with non-humans, and again, they maybe not be so colorful and sort of extraordinary in the way that Paul Nicklin described. However, the story does deserve us diving a little bit deeper under the surface for a couple of reasons. One, as he mentioned, and again, he pointed out as a biologist, from an evolutionary biology perspective, it's unusual and unexpected that a species such as a leopard seal, they're also called sea leopards who live in the Antarctic, really puts out that much energy and investment in another species, unless it's eating a penguin, for example. And there is no sort of gain or reciprocity that's anticipated when it's intraspecific or even interspecific within a particular community. So the idea of all of this energy and focus that the leopard seal had on Paul Nicklin, the underwater diver, was quite unusual. And she also not only expended a lot of energy, but she also made herself vulnerable, as he pointed out, when there was another sea leopard. There's not necessarily going to be a fight, but nonetheless, her focus and energy was really extended to another species. And then there's the man himself, his own experience. Now, the piece that you heard was very entertaining and kind of funny, and you could hear the audience laughing. But in other interviews and in discussions with Paul, he revealed the impact emotionally that he had from this encounter. And he's a very seasoned diver. He spends, I think, probably most of his life underwater. And he's had a lot of time with whales, orcas, sharks, all sorts of different kinds of sea life. but this particular incident really stuck out. And in his interviews, he talked about it this way. For example, he said, I fell in love with this seal. And he's using the love in a way, not like I love wine, I love pizza, or I fell in love, but love in a more profound, moving way, a kind of a maturity of feelings. And this particular quote from him, I think, captures it quite well. He said, I'd fall asleep at night with tears coming down my cheeks. I was so grateful. I think that's why I get emotional, because we had such a connection. So he was talking about the intervening days. He was there for 2 days, just, at night, just sort of processing the experience that he had. And the key word here is connection. And that term of connection is something that does not just speak of the man or the leopard seal, but what lies in between. So if we were talking about two humans, we might talk about their experience and their connection in terms of empathy or empathetic resonance as such, where the internal states of another individual we can perceive and sort of, vicariously experience the internal states of another being. And Dan Siegel, you may be familiar with him. He uses maybe you all do this, I don't know how common it is, but he uses the fist as a very kind of a first order model of the brain. And so the idea is that the mirror neurons are parts of the brain pick up, perceive, communicate to the insula, to the limbic structures, down into the brainstem and body. And this is this kind of process of the embodiment, again, of the internal states of another individual. And this is something that we all experience, whether it's at work or in intimate relationships that we have with others in our lives. But now really what's emerging is that this is not unique to humans, to our species. In 2012, a group of eminent neuroscientists, including quantum physicist Stephen Hawking, stood on the steps of Cambridge University in the UK and read from what they called the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness. This was a document that they created and was kind of like a manifesto. And this is one quotation from there, that humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. Now, that's really quite an extraordinary statement. However, their assertion is built on decades, if not centuries, of biomedical and neuroscience research, which uses non-humans, animals, cats, rats, non-human primates, dogs, etc., even fruit flies, as surrogates in lieu of humans to probe the human mind and body. So rats and mice in various experiments are used to look at, for example, the genesis of psychopathology, etc. And really, the underlying tacit assumption and premise is that all of these species share with us common brain structures and processes that give us the capacities to think, feel, how we behave, and consciousness. And just below here, what you see sort of blinking back and forth are different vertebrate brains. And although they have different morphologies, it's really more of variations on a theme rather than the other way around. And there may be singularities. For example, bats can perceive things that we can't. Parrots, for example, can see UV that we can't, etc. And there are singularities in the brain, but the fundamental structures and processes which govern thinking, feeling, consciousness, etc., and the whole rainbow of experiences that we have are common to other species. And despite how different we may look on the inside, this really says that what we are on the inside is shared. And this is a quote from Eric Jarvis. He's a professor at Rockefeller University, a neuroscientist, and also at Duke University School of Medicine and Neuroscience. This is a quote that's actually from my book, Carnivore Minds, where I give a sort of a neuropsychological treatment for different quote unquote carnivore species, including bears who are really omnivorous. And Eric says, a reptile brain is similar to a bird brain, and both are similar to mammalians, that's including us, which implies that they have parallel capacities to think, feel, experience consciousness, and these abilities to function mentally. So these wonderful crocodiles look so different and have been called reptilian brains. Either they have human brains or we have reptile brains, but there is no longer a reptilian brain in the sense of a primitive type of brain shared across species. So the declaration, the Cambridge Declaration, and other work that has come out is really speaking more openly of what has been tacitly assumed for decades. And the Cambridge neuroscientists, as well as others, have included invertebrates such as the octopus. And now the honeybee is kind of going down the scale of the old Scala Natura to really include other species and other invertebrates that share the capacities that we do. And of course, in the media and other literature, you're seeing discussion, of course, from a different perspective, not necessarily the neuroscience, but looking at trees and their capacities that are comparable to our own. So what that means is that this division, this Adam's wall, or there's various names for it, this division between humans and other species, nature, the rest of nature, has really been dissolved by this emergence of a field that might be called transspecies neuropsychology. I coined the term transspecies psychology when I was doing my dissertation. And at the time, I just use it as a convenience, mainly to my colleagues and classmates as a way to really sort of communicate that there was a unitary model of brain, mind, and behavior. That's the trans. It sounds kind of Star Trek-y, but that was the idea. Now, implicit in this working model of a unitary transspecies capacity is bidirectional inference. And the convention, which still remains, again, a lot of this is sort of this, we're at this kind of edge where we're really shifting paradigms, if I wanted to use that word. But the convention, for example, with animal models, using animals in lieu of humans, has been to take what we learn and study from experimentation and things like that from non-humans, and then apply that to make inference about how humans function, feel, and think, etc. But the unitary model really says, no, we can have what we learn and we know and we intuit from ourselves can be applied to non-humans, non-human animals with equal inferential rigor. So what that means is this is actually Robert Sapolsky. He's a professor of neuroscience and primatology at Stanford. And this is a picture of him when he's in Africa with one of his baboons that he studied. And he said he really actually didn't like this baboon, but there is a resemblance. Anyways, so the idea then is that we have this inferential symmetry, which of course then resonates with this whole concept of empathy. And that means really when we have these sort of gut feelings or connections, the way Paul Nicklin talked about it, when we look at other animals, for example, these beautiful orcas, we sense that they love each other, that there's a family that has care, etc. Or in this case here, this is a baby bear that Charlie Russell, he took in orphan bears in Russia and he raised them and reintroduced them to the wild. This is a picture he took. So when we see this picture, for example, and there's an implicit joy, we might feel the same kind of joy and the kind of playfulness that this bear is enjoying. They really love to slide down snowbanks, evidently. Or, for example, curiosity and conversation. These are emperor penguins and a young seal. I'm not sure what's going on here, but that's kind of the point. It's intriguing, and we can use this sort of freedom of understanding. We don't have to fear anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism, which used to be this sort of taboo no-no that Paul Nicklin mentioned, is really bidirectional inference. Now, that being said, we have to have the caveat of the precaution of projection, just like we have with each other. So we function on a kind of a foundation that we share the same kinds of things, we have the same various kinds of capacities, etc. That being said, each one of us has had different experiences. Each one of us has different sort of ethics and agendas. So we have to be, somewhat critical. But at a fundamental level, when we see these kinds of, expressions and behaviors, and when we sense it, it is aligned with and consonant with this idea of this unitary model of brain, mind, and consciousness. And this includes even very nuanced capacities and qualities, such as aesthetics. This is a bear, a brown bear. Brown bears are the counterparts to grizzly bears. Grizzly bears are North American, brown bears are in Eurasia. This is a photograph again by Charlie Russell. I talk a lot about him, and I encourage you because Charlie's such a wonderful person. He passed a few years ago. I worked with him 10 years, and he was Canadian, and he lived with grizzly bears all his life, very intimately, and then spent 10 years in Kamchatka in the peninsula, where he was really trying to explore and demonstrate that living with these fierce creatures was really fine, and there wasn't really a danger if you understood them. That's where he did this work on, it wasn't his intention, but he ended up rescuing 10 orphan baby bears whose mothers had been killed. And he took them and he had built a cabin, and he raised them and reintroduced them into the wild, and they joined Wild Bear Society and lived fully as bears. So this bear here, he named Sitting Bear, and she's a female bear that every evening, and of course this is summertime, you can't say that the sun set at twilight, she would sit in this one place and just look out over the lake. So he called her Sitting Bear, and really admired her for her, a sense of aesthetics. And unfortunately, all these wonderful capacities and qualities and abilities that we have also include distress and despair. This is Pepper. She was used as a biomedical subject for many years until she was rescued by Fauna. And she obviously had suffered severe trauma. So this brings us also to post-traumatic stress disorder and my work with elephants during my dissertation and later. I had gone to Africa for the first time in the 1990s, and I was part of the National Science Foundation that was interested in looking at lions. Lions, elephants, and leopards, the big five, were all being translocated en masse to South Africa, where they had been extirpated, that is locally extinguished during apartheid and whatever. So they were trying to repopulate the parks and the reserves in anticipation of the fall of apartheid and then the opening of ecotourism, because there was a ban on travel in many countries. So when I was in Africa, I was focused on lions, but all the park biologists that we ran into were really concerned about this mass deaths of white and black rhinoceroses who are endangered. And these individuals were found dead. Now, initially, they thought these were poachers because rhinoceroses are often killed for their horns, which are used for traditional medicinal purposes. However, over time, and over 100 rhinoceroses were found dead in several parks, they found out and they realized that the quote unquote perpetrators, the agents of the rhinoceros deaths, were in fact young male bulls. They were teenage male elephants, African elephants. And in some cases, and this was actually first recorded by a tourist, was not only were the rhinoceroses killed, but in some instances, the young male elephants, the teenage elephants, sexually assaulted the rhinoceroses. So again, this went well beyond the anecdote because there was over 100 deaths and it was quite systemic. Now, initially, biologists and elephant researchers, when they were confronted with this perplexing, very anomalous behavior, elephants they're herbivorous, they eat plants, they're very pacific, they don't pick fights. And what they noted is that these young elephants, these teenage male elephants, were not living in the kind of social structure which was normative. And that was at their age living with mature elder male bulls older than 30. So they imported several adult male elephants into the parks to see if that would have an effect. And that's what's kind of a kind of giving sideboards and structure to the young males who had gone into must, which is the sexual hormonal time when you can see the dripping down. They had gone in prematurely as teenagers. That doesn't happen until they're usually in their 30s. So they brought the male bulls in, and for a while it worked. However, not too long after, the behavior of the young males started up again. They became aggressive. There was some more interspecific killing, etc. And the reason why, which was, where my studies came in, was it was not so much social structure, but rather the processes and experiences and lack thereof of some that the young males were not functioning. They did not have normative upbringing as such. So we go back again to look at how the brain and the mind are shaped. Obviously, this is quite simplistic for you all, but it's in relationship. And essentially, this is really kind of a pattern that's happening not only in the sciences, or I should say the human or medical sciences and developmental and psychology, but also across disciplines, physics, quantum physics, and other areas of biology, et cetera, more of a relational approach, looking at complexity theory, chaos theory, those are from mathematics and ecology, looking at a relational understanding of how things evolve and develop. So here then, the mind and the brain are shaped by the interactions that are experienced. And it used to be, from infancy, like the work of John Bowlby, who was a clinical psychologist from the United Kingdom. He did the seminal work on attachment theory in the 1940s and 50s when he was working with orphaned or abused and neglected, abandoned children. And that was his discovery, was the importance. It wasn't just food and shelter, but it was the emotional and psychological, social nurturance that was missing, that was causing disorders and symptoms in children. So this whole notion is that the quality and nature of the relationships that a baby, an infant experiences really shape the brain and how it functions, how they behave, our ethics, et cetera, and how and if empathy for another is cultivated. So this goes not only for humans, but for other species. So I'll just take a few minutes here and talk about elephants. This is a short course in elephant society. A baby elephant, of course, bonds very deeply with his or her mother. They nurse with the mother, of course, for 4 years. However, the mother is not the only one that provides nursing milk for the babies. Elephants are born in really the nucleus of elephant society, which is what it's called the natal family. And that's a group of the mother and siblings and cousins and allomothers, aunties. Some have children, some do not. They're usually led by a matriarch. And this is really, like I said, the nucleus, the core of elephant society. Now, females stay with the natal family. However, when they're teenage, 9, 10, 12, something like that, the young bulls, the young males go off and join an all-bull area, an all-bull group. And they stay in this, that constellation until sexual maturity, which is sometimes around 30 or that time. So that's the second stage of socialization. But the whole of elephant, all of these aspects is really nested into this sort of octopus of elephant society, which used to stretch all over Africa, kind of this anastomosing octopus of the society. So it's many, many layers, a lot of interactions, many, many different layers in society. So an elephant psyche, an elephant mind, an elephant brain is really shaped in this multi-layer society. It's very much parallel to a lot of traditional indigenous human societies. So the baby experiences not only his or her mother, but the aunties, siblings, all of this time while the brain and the mind and the emotions are developing. And they do this is intentionally a photo here of a rhinoceros and an elephant, is that they develop relationships with other species and members of other species. As I said, they're quite pacific and are herbivorous and form relationships with others. So again, this is the sort of a snapshot of a normative development of an infant elephant. However, the young teenage male elephants that killed and sexually assaulted the rhinoceroses did not have this experience. They did not follow this developmental arc. And in fact, when I looked at their biographies, it was revealed that they had suffered multiple traumas. They had witnessed, for one, they had witnessed the slaughter, usually with gun-bearing helicopters, of their family, their mother, etc. They were prematurely weaned. And again, the weaning, then the nursing, the up to 4 years or more, is just one very vital stage, which has to do with the brain and mind development and those relational qualities. So they were typically at that time, that was the 1980s, 1 to 2 years old maximum. They couldn't transport, and at that time, elephants larger. So these were real babies at the time when they experienced this. You can see this picture here. This baby has, the infant, his eyes are bugged out. They were removed, they were put in trucks, and they were transported to other reserves. And again, the idea was to repopulate the parks and private reserves for ecotourism. Elephants are a big attraction. So they were brought to, ecologies that were very different from their heritage. And that's quite significant. Elephant researchers talk about that, their knowledge of the land, which is both genetic and experiential. And they were left alone in the sense of there were perhaps other infants there, but there were no other elephants that were older. In one park, there was a couple of older female elephants, but they had been brought from the United States, I believe, by a former zookeeper or circus keeper, and they were reintroduced there, but they had been raised in captivity, so they really were not functional as a mother, or the whole constellation of the natal family was lacking. So looking at their symptoms and looking at their history, it became very clear, just sort of fell out, that they were conforming to a diagnosis. I'm from the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, to post-traumatic stress disorder, and actually complex given the multiple traumas that they sustained. In addition to, I spoke to a lot of different researchers, and I would ask them, have you seen anything strange with the elephants and things like that? And they reported a number of very anomalous kinds of behavior other than this rhinoceros thing. But I would say the formative, substantial, confirming data came from the David Sheldrick Wildlife Trust. That's I guess you call it sort of a type of sanctuary in Kenya that was established by Daphne Sheldrick, who's an amazing woman. And over the years, she passed a few years ago. I recommend reading her recent book, her autobiography. And you can go to their website. It's incredible. They have rescued hundreds of orphan baby elephants over the years and been very successful. Daphne actually is credited with coming up with the formula for elephant milk. Cow milk didn't work, goat milk didn't work, things like that. So that was really a saving. But really, her success has been emulating the natal family, emotionally, psychologically, et cetera, from an attachment perspective of normative elephant society. So in discussion with Daphne, these are some criteria that are used for diagnosing post-traumatic stress. This one is exposure to a traumatic event. Of course, that's what there was, that they witnessed the slaughter, the death. They themselves feared for their lives. They saw their family injured and killed. The second criteria then is experiencing well, the classic thing is flashbacks. These elephants, Daphne talked about that the babies had spontaneous screaming in the middle of the day. They had nightmares. They were triggered. Some of them were triggered when they saw a blanket or they heard a truck, because they associated that, even though the blanket was wrapped around them to protect them initially, they associate that with the traumatic event. And of course, the truck with transport, et cetera. And they were very reactive in a lot of settings. Another one is having to do that these are kinds of psychological symptoms and behaviors that were not normative, and they did not happen before the trauma. They were human avoidant. They showed tremendous fear. These babies that usually love to play and interact were apathetic. They were listless, and even went so far as being asocial and seeking isolation. Again, this is not normative. Elephants are very family oriented. They're very touchy-feely, literally. And so this was really, really extraordinary behavior, but obviously not unexpected when viewed from the perspective of their experience and trauma. Something that was significant is this was not passing. This lasted more than a month. They were, a lot of them had insomnia. They showed belligerence. They were distracted, exaggerated startle response. And in other cases, these are when I was discussing this with other researchers, that they noticed that there was even infanticide. In fact, infanticide is rather rampant and epidemic. PTSD is just epidemic in South African parks and reserves. There was intra and interspecific even today. Females are killing each other and each other's children. And something that's also extraordinary is infant neglect. So all of these data really pull together, and we're really confirming beyond the rhinocides as such. So just in a more sort of a technical kind of way, this is a description. Alan Shore has been a co-author with me. Some of you might know him. He's a clinical psychologist at UCLA. He's produced among, a plethora of publications, but he has a 3-tome neuroattachment series, which is really quite in detail. And he's been focusing a lot on the right brain development, which is associated with emotions, et cetera. So PTSD then has its origins in the inability of the right prefrontal cortex to modulate amygdala functions, and without orbital prefrontal feedback, there's a continued level of threat, and the organism, elephant person, remains in an amygdala-driven defense response respect. Anyways, the whole point of that is just to sort of translate the symptoms that were observed, the behaviors, et cetera, the events, and that is consistent then with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress. So essentially what these experiences were for these individuals, these infants, was a profound rupture of the nurturing, as John Bowlby would call it, the secure attachment, which really is kind of the regulating mechanism for stress, for affect, empathy, et cetera. And, Pat Ogden has done this work where you're talking about really those experiences develop this window of tolerance, the hypo arousal. So to stay within that normative, healthful state. And the infant elephants did not experience that kind of regulation, and therefore develop the symptoms and behaviors that they did. Now, we're not sure what the mechanisms were, in other words, for the rhino killings and also for the sexual assault of the rhino. So these are just three postulated hypotheses. There could have been, with the trauma, impaired ability for correct signal detection. Another possible mechanism was that there was signal transmission within the brain, a problem. So they detected a scent hormone, and when it got in the brain, it's all mixed up. And cognitive, social, and social sensory processing. So the processing itself in that way of the signals. So we don't know. I don't know, maybe someone has figured that out. But this really shows an example of the depth to which the brains and the minds and psyches of these individuals were impacted by the experiences that they had and the experiences that they didn't have as they were developing. We see severe trauma and diagnoses of complex PTSD are consistent with what is observed in zoos. These are zoo elephants, safari elephants, both in Asia, elephant rides and labor camps in Asia and in Africa, and in circuses. And again, most of these individuals are trained, quote unquote, which is really torture. They're separated from their family. This elephant on the right, this is in Nepal. She was separated from her family, and she sits in these kind of pretzel-like things. She's chained. She's desperate to touch and be with her family, but she can't. Very heartbreaking situations. Unfortunately, we see this not only with elephants, but with other species that are kept in captivity. This is Shamu. He's a, I think he's a he, at SeaWorld. But you probably have heard about Tilikum, who died a few years ago. Tilikum was also taken as a baby, an infant, an orca, and he was kept at SeaWorld. He was trained, quote unquote, and lived in basically something that's as big as a bathtub relative to them. And he ended up killing 3 trainers. So I write about that again in Carnivore Minds. And something that's really important, it's not just this aggression thing. Orcas never kill humans. This stretches back thousands of years. From indigenous people report that there has never been an orca death in the wild. The only harm and injury that an orca has ever done has been in captivity. And again, this is going back thousands of years. So it's against their ethic, for whatever reason. It's against their cultural ethic and mores to injure humans. Now, they kill whales, they do other things, but they don't touch humans. So for Tilikum and other orcas have done so as well, to kill trainers, and they develop a relationship. They're all relational beings, is quite profound. And I describe it as really a sort of a harikiri, kind of a suicide in a sense, that he was so broken internally, and it was knowing what he did. I mean, that's my interpretation of it, but it was profound for an orca to kill a human. So that gives you an index about the depth to which they suffer. It's not just animals in captivity. hunting. These are brown bears from Bradshaw. Again, Charlie took this picture. Bears, wolves, deer, there's annual hunts. So we have this trauma happening over and over and over. Selectively, older animals are killed in hunting. So what you're doing is you're causing relational trauma, orphaning. They don't have these relational nurturance that shape, and so you're really setting things up for trauma. Now, for example, you might have heard this, it happens every once in a while. Bears very, very, very rarely kill a human. Same with other quote unquote predators, wolves, coyotes, etc., and pumas. Very, very rarely. A few years ago in Yellowstone, there was a gentleman, I think he was in his 70s, and he had gone there for decades. So he was very familiar. He was very seasoned in terms of being out in the wilderness. And he was in this area. I think he was studying, he might have been a botanist. Anyways, he was attacked and killed by a grizzly. And it turned out that that grizzly had been darted, anesthetized by researchers for some purpose. And when he killed a man, he had, the researchers had left, but he was in this sort of anesthesia, haze. And you have to understand that as trauma, because when people use a dart gun, it's a gun. And it's traumatic physiologically as well as psychologically. He probably thought he was dying. And then he wakes up in this sort of, like I said, sort of an anesthesia or whatever the medication is for that kind of a haze. And so those things happen. So I also want to bring up deer. It happens over and over. They witness their mother killed or their family killed. They're prematurely weaned. They don't have that kind of structure. They have a similar, it's different than elephants, but they have this society. And all of these animals have society. So the difference between, someone had asked me, well, do you think elephants got PTSD before? And I don't have the real answer, but this is my logic, is no, because they learn things, kind of what we would call a master narrative. Like a lion might really scare, might almost kill a little baby, but they're in their society. So we have this resilience, they have the nurturance and the healing. They are raised in this quote unquote secure attachment. So their ability to respond appropriately and recuperate is better, staying within this, even though they go hyperarousal, they come back in. And again, there is this sort of structure and process of socialization and support. And plus it's in their master narrative, it's their story. There aren't gun-bearing helicopters that come out of nowhere. There's no place to escape. There's no way to escape. And that's the kind of thing that the wildlife are experiencing. Habitat loss, fragmentation. So some people have talked about this landscape of fear. So there's no surety, there's poaching. So there's really no way of kind of ratcheting back to a normative level of health, psychological and physiological health. So I don't know who came up with this, but it's a great quote, that PTSD is a natural response to unnatural conditions. So now we're going to come back from all the elephant land in Africa and elsewhere back to our favorite leopard seal and diver, Paul Nicklin and the female leopard seal. So we can now kind of understand, or perhaps have an understanding or some kind of feeling that there was this empathetic resonance, that the empathy and the care and concern that Paul Nicklin detected and perceived in the leopard seal, that was sparked and then nurtured and then kind of fanned the internal flames of his own feelings that touched him so profoundly. And so we can look at it that her reaching out in terms of care, for whatever reason she was concerned and showed care for him, was really compassion, is empathy in action. And so this was this connection that she felt and that was contagious with him. And she put that into action with her penguin sacrifices to him. And it also really underscores something that's really important. This is Charlie Russell with one of his orphan bears who's growing up. Her name is Biscuit. That animals really have the capacity to, they have an identity beyond form. In other words, yes, they know a human. Yes, they know a bear. Yes, they know a seal, all those kinds of things. They know a penguin, that's for sure. But at the same time, they don't have these rigid barriers that modern humans have developed in terms of a species line, so that their sense of self really is much more fluid rather than a rigid barrier or boundary in that way. So we can think of the leopard seal as that her efforts to Paul Nicklin, because of this empathy, of this connection, this deep passion that we all have at some point, at some time for another, really was an individual not coming to the aid of another, but they were gestures of someone reaching to out herself. Again, this notion of a sense of identity, which is larger than the form that we occupy. This is Charlie again with Biscuit, and they're just kind of having a day at the lake. And it's very beautiful. It's in Kamchatka. I really recommend, there's a film that you can put on, you can get on the internet. It's called Edge of Eden, BBC with Jeff and Sue Turner. And it's a beautiful film that they made about Charlie and his bears. So you can watch that. It's free. And you can read Charlie's book. Grizzly Heart is one of them. So I'll close with this quote from David Bohm. David Bohm, you might know, was a quantum physicist. He was unusual in the sense, well, Stephen Hawking did too, but David Bohm was kind of the heir apparent of Albert Einstein. And he was different in the sense of that he took the discoveries of quantum physics to the street and looked at it, what the philosophical and ethical implications of quantum physics were, more than just the fancy tricks of what it actually does for us, but rather looking at the philosophical and ethical fundaments. And so he said this here: the notion of a separate organism is clearly an abstraction, as is also its boundary. Underlying all this is unbroken wholeness. Thank you.
Thank you, Gay. Is Alex want to take back over, or we're going to open it up for a Q&A. And so if you'd like to either raise your hand, or you can put a question in the chat and I can read them. So up to you. You're getting hand claps in the participant list, Gay.
Oh, okay. They're claps, not slaps. Okay.
Yeah. Dr. Gushee, do you have a question?
Actually, I have a comment. I really appreciate you opening with Paul Nicklin. Paul Nicklin's a very good friend of mine. I've known Paul for a long time. We've spent a ton of time in the Arctic, and also I think I have 18 trips to Antarctica, a lot of them with him, including supporting him and Joran, who he talks about in that story, where we did a story for the magazine. He did a story for the magazine. I was just schlepping gear, but we camped on the sea ice. And it was a story about emperor penguins, and it was an underwater story. So I'm an ER doc, and he asked me to go because the contracting required that there was a doctor at the ice edge because of leopard seal risk. And
okay, yeah.
This was after he did that other story, which definitely made his career. But he had this impression. He and Joran both had the impression that leopard seals are these warm, fuzzy creatures because of that experience that he had. And but because their hunting is very different over in the Ross Sea for emperor penguins, they're much bigger. And we had the experience of being attacked twice by leopard seals that came out of the water. One grabbed me, another one knocked over Paul. But the interesting thing about it is, although they're extremely aggressive predators against emperor penguins, and they'll grab them and pull them into the water and drown them, which is what they do, they clearly recognized that we were different. And the one that grabbed my arm let me go, and the one that knocked Paul over just looked surprised and confused and went back into the water. And I think it clearly shows that they're thinking animals, and they understand that we're not what they wanted. I think Paul is still trying to figure out what that was about when the seal was trying to feed him, because he's not replicated that ever again.
Mhm.
But we did also have the experience, we camped 5 miles away from the penguin colony so that we wouldn't disturb them. But we had penguins that walked that far just to hang out with us, even though there's nothing, they've never seen people before, and there was nothing that we could possibly give them or that they were looking for. And I thought that that was a very interesting interaction with animals, you know, as you described. They're not for their purposes, but kind of there for our purposes. So it was really interesting. Anyway, yeah, Paul's an interesting guy. He's got a bunch of YouTube videos and the longer version of the one we saw.
Yes.
And there's also one he talks about the experience that we had. He does one about that as well. So he's a great speaker if you ever get a chance to hear him.
That's terrific. Well, I might come after you because I'm writing a book with Darsha Narvaez, who is a moral neuropsychologist, and she's been very much interested in you know, child moral and ethical development. So our book is called The Evolved Nest, and where every chapter is sort of an aspect of development from the different species. And one of them is the emperor penguin.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm looking at that as detachment model. So I might come looking for you for emperor penguin insights.
Well, I've spent a lot of time with them. And I will also mention another Paul story. He sent me after he did a story on spirit bears in British Columbia, which are white black bears. Suggested I go up there with this guide that he had. And we were up there for, I don't know, 12 days, 15 days trying to find spirit bears, and had a lot of interactions with grizzlies, including charged by a mother grizzly. But we were there with a guide, no weapons, no nothing. And as the grizzly had charged us and attacked, he merely spoke to her in a very quiet voice. And he said, "Close enough, Mom." And she got within about 30 feet on this charge, and she sat down and huffed and puffed, and he just talked to her in a normal voice and had a conversation. And she turned and walked around us and went down to the river.
I was wondering if that was if you met Charlie, because I think Charlie and Paul have actually met.
I think they have. No, I did not meet him. This was a native guide that Paul had used when he did the story up there on spirit bears.
Yeah, Charlie has a book on spirit bears as well, which is neat. Oh, terrific. Well, wonderful.
Yeah.
Who else? We don't have anything in the chat. If you just want to speak up.
Yeah, this is Bob Lang. And I'd just like to, I want to put a plug in for your Orca ethics. That was just changing for me. It was a life change when I listened to you and how you described orcas not having prison camps and concentration camps and not killing each other, not having guns, not having airplanes, and having this beautiful society. And I live out on the tip of, I think I've told you this, Johnson Point, and I kayak frequently. And on one my first occasion with the orcas, I happened to be, I was fishing actually off my beach and heard this, and around came 5 orcas, 2 mothers and 3 juveniles. And I launched my kayak and went out, and I spent 2 hours with them, and they did everything orcas do. And they were obviously having a good time jumping and all around me. And that was an amazing experience. And the second occurred, I had my window open, I heard slap, slap, slap in the about 5:30 in the morning. And here there's at least 2, 3, maybe 4 orcas out. And they're, I think, obviously seal hunting. Mm-hmm. And I launched my kayak again, and I just launched, and I was a little way off the beach. And you're not allowed to get close to them, and I didn't expect to, but I had my camera, or I had an iPad, and I see a little swirl out of the corner of my eye, and I look down in the water, crystal clear, and Mother Orca is cruising right under my kayak, and we looked eye to eye.
Extraordinary.
That was an experience, and that has ever since that. So then I read, of course, The Blackfish Prophecy. I don't know if you can see this. Highly recommended. It came out, we bought it, I think, off your site. And Rachel Clark really captures the essence of the thinking orca and yeah, just absolutely fascinating. So these creatures, they have minds, and that orca, I think she thought I was a seal, because seals I've read since then I was dragging my kayak over the stony beach, and of course they hear the seals and their bellies on the beach, very similar. And so I was, a seal until she realized who I was, and came up right in front of me and just took off and surfaced in Case Inlet, or in the just in the strait, ways a mile away. But just absolutely amazing experience. And they are thinking beings that really, I think, to be phenomenal. As I say, I think I'd written to you about, and I know you have an undergrad degree in linguists.
Yeah.
To be able to figure out how to really truly speak and communicate with them would be phenomenal.
Yeah.
And
Well, one of the photographs, the man with the shark, was taken by a Belgian, Fred Boy. And again, it's in my carnivore book where I have a chapter on orcas. And anyways, he's a free diver, which means he uses a single breath, and he doesn't use scuba because it creates bubbles, and bubbles is often a communication media, which can cause miscommunication and intrude. And that particular thing, he was, he's worked a lot with whales, and they have a project with some other, I think he's a French engineer. It's called Darwin, like Darwin with an E in there, DAREWIN. And they're very interested in uncoding, no pun intended, because of the codas, the language of sperm whales. And that's an extraordinary culture as well. And the orcas, which they all have their separate cultures. There's all these different cultures, and they don't mix. And one of the differences, for example, the orcas are only eat largely, like high percentage of their diet is salmon. That's called the southern residents, and they're doing very poorly because of all the dams and the overfishing, and they don't switch. So just things like that really give you insight into the ancient and the deep cultures and what lies within that. Again, Charlie Russell was always puzzling about, the bear guy was always puzzling about, what is it why won't orcas hurt humans? There's this taboo, and I talk about this taboo purely from just a kind of a phenomenological perspective. But there's so much more than meets the eye, except the eye that you saw.
Yes, right. No, there was absolute communication. It was just an amazing sensation to look eye to eye.
Yeah.
And there was an exchange.
Yeah.
No question.
We'll keep kayaking.
Oh yeah, boy, I'll tell you. The next time we'll be swimming if I get a thicker wetsuit.
Yeah.
That's all I need. So yeah, quite an
Are there any more
experience.
questions for Dr. Bradshaw?
Well, thank you all for being so patient this late on a work week. So I appreciate it. You must be tired.
No,
Thanks so much for being here for us.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I appreciate it. So
Thank
keep
you so
sending
much.
keep sending the orca stories and the emperor penguin stories.
will do. Look forward to seeing you down at Carrillo sometime.
Yeah,
I'd love to
yeah.
visit there.
Well, I'll be up in Washington, I think probably this summer. So
Well, let me know, all right?
I will.
Yeah, got
All
a
right.
standing invitation. Thank
Okie
you.
doke. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, Danielle. Danielle, I have to tell you, we have a new rabbit at our sanctuary, and her name is Danielle. I'll send you a photo.
Well, Jessica Rabbit is my nickname. Just kidding.
Oh, is it? Okay. Bye, you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great.
And we have recorded this for anybody that's interested.
Fantastic.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
for
Danielle,
coming.
everybody.
Thanks,
Good
Danielle.
seeing
You're welcome.
you, Cindy. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Danielle.
You're welcome. Thanks everybody for coming.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for the food.
Oh yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks, Danielle. Great to see you.
Good to see you, Nancy.
Food was great, Danielle. Thank you very much.
Good. You're so welcome. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.
It was really good, as usual.
Yeah, they're so good. And I did get to have some cauliflower with tahini because Jessica, I was going to donate what was left because I always do, but there was only 3 left. And
Oh,
so they
that's
brought
great.
them over here and I'm like, oh, just take them home because I'm like, I'm triggered. But I did have some I said, just give me the cauliflower and the kale and leave. So, anyway, so I had my tilapia on top of some kale. So it was good. It was good. Anyway, thanks everybody.
All right, see ya. Nice job, Alex.
Oh, thanks. See you guys soon.
See ya.
Okay.